The Love Parade disaster of July 24, 2010 in Duisburg, Germany, did not begin on the day people entered the tunnel, nor did it originate in panic, chaos, or irrational behavior, but instead emerged from a long process of structural compromise, political pressure, economic desperation, and institutional neglect that unfolded over years, gradually transforming a cultural celebration into one of the deadliest crowd disasters in modern European history. And to understand how more than 1 million people were funneled into a confined industrial space with only a single viable access route, one must first understand what the Love Parade had become by the end of its existence. The Love Parade began in 1989 in Berlin as a political demonstration advocating peace, love, and tolerance through electronic music, held on the Kurfürstendamm and later the Straße des 17. Juni, wide boulevards capable of absorbing massive pedestrian movement. And during the 1990s it grew rapidly as electronic dance music entered the mainstream, attracting hundreds of thousands of attendees and eventually becoming less a protest and more a commercialized mega-event, sponsored by corporations, promoted internationally, and used by host cities as a branding tool. By the early 2000s, Berlin withdrew support due to rising costs and safety concerns, and the Love Parade became a traveling event, moving between cities in the Ruhr region that were eager to host it as a symbol of post-industrial renewal, despite lacking the infrastructure originally designed for crowds of that scale. Duisburg, once a major steel and coal hub, had suffered decades of economic decline, unemployment, and population loss, and city officials viewed hosting the Love Parade as an opportunity to reposition Duisburg as vibrant and modern, drawing tourists and media attention, even though internal assessments made clear that the city center could not safely accommodate the expected crowd size. The chosen site, a former freight yard near the main railway station, was surrounded by active rail lines, highways, and industrial structures, effectively forming a closed basin with limited access, and critically, the primary entry and exit route for attendees was designated as a single tunnel beneath the railway tracks leading to a narrow ramp into the festival area, a configuration that violated fundamental principles of crowd safety by creating a bidirectional bottleneck with no redundancy, no emergency bypass, and no meaningful evacuation capacity. Planning documents and expert consultations repeatedly raised alarms about the site's unsuitability, warning that crowd densities could quickly exceed safe thresholds and that emergency vehicles would have difficulty accessing the area, yet political pressure to proceed remained intense, and responsibility for safety was fragmented between the city administration, the private event organizer Lopevent, and police authorities, each assuming that others would manage critical risks while legal approvals were granted despite the fact that the event did not fully meet regulatory safety requirements, a decision later justified internally by assumptions that operational measures could compensate for structural deficiencies. On the morning of July 24, 2010, trains and buses began arriving in Duisburg from across Germany and neighboring countries, delivering tens of thousands of people per hour into a city center that had no capacity to absorb them, and by midday attendance estimates had already been exceeded, though no effective mechanism existed to halt arrivals or communicate capacity limits to those still en route. As crowds were funneled toward the tunnel, police attempted to regulate flow using temporary cordons, intermittently stopping incoming attendees to prevent overcrowding inside the festival grounds. But these measures were poorly coordinated and inconsistently communicated, resulting in a dangerous buildup of pressure within the tunnel as people at the rear continued moving forward, unaware that those ahead were no longer able to advance. The tunnel itself was a concrete corridor approximately 240 meters long, with limited ventilation, sloping slightly upward toward the ramp, its walls reflecting sound and heat, and as the afternoon progressed, crowd density increased to levels where individual movement became impossible, transforming the mass of people into a compressible body where force transmitted through torsos rather than feet, a phenomenon well understood in crowd dynamics but catastrophically underestimated by planners. Contrary to early media reports, there was no sudden stampede, no explosive outbreak of panic, but rather a slow, relentless compression as people were pressed closer together, chest against back, arms pinned to sides, breathing becoming shallow and labored, while music continued to play in the distance, masking cries for help, and mobile phone networks collapsed under the load, severing communication with the outside world. As exhaustion and heat took their toll, individuals began to stumble, and in such densities, A single fall was enough to create a fatal chain reaction, as bodies became obstacles that others were forced against, increasing pressure on those already down, leading to compressive asphyxia where the chest cannot expand and oxygen deprivation occurs within minutes. Desperate attempts to escape saw people climbing staircases, traffic signs, lighting poles, and even scaling walls, not to flee in panic but to gain elevation and relieve pressure on their lungs, while others attempted to form human chains to pull unconscious victims free, acts of cooperation that contradicted later narratives of chaos but were largely invisible amid the scale of the disaster. Police officers on site, lacking training in mass crowd extraction and operating without a unified command structure, struggled to respond, and emergency vehicles were unable to reach the scene due to blocked access routes, forcing paramedics to carry equipment and victims by hand through dense crowds, losing crucial time as oxygen deprivation turned survivable distress into fatal injury. By the time authorities recognized the full severity of the situation and attempted to reverse crowd flow, ordering exits to be opened and cordons removed, the damage had already been done as the crowd itself had become structurally locked, bodies compressed so tightly that movement was no longer possible, and attempts to push or pull only redistributed lethal pressure elsewhere. When the crowd finally thinned later in the afternoon, the tunnel and ramp revealed a scene of devastation, with personal belongings scattered across the ground, emergency workers performing CPR on multiple victims simultaneously, and survivors in visible shock, many unaware until hours later that people around them had died. 21 people lost their lives, ranging in age from teenagers to adults in their 30s, and more than 500 were injured, though thousands more carried psychological trauma that would surface in nightmares, panic disorders, and survivors' guilt long after physical wounds healed. In the immediate aftermath, officials described the tragedy as a stampede caused by panic, a framing that shifted blame onto the crowd itself. But this narrative was later dismantled by video evidence, expert testimony, and survivor accounts showing that the crowd behaved rationally under impossible conditions and that the true causes lay in planning failures, ignored warnings, and a venue fundamentally unfit for the event. Subsequent investigations exposed falsified safety documents, last-minute plan changes, and internal communications acknowledging risks that were nonetheless accepted for political and economic reasons, while legal proceedings became mired in delays, jurisdictional disputes, and the challenge of assigning individual criminal responsibility within a system that had failed collectively, ultimately ending without convictions, a result that deepened public outrage and left many families feeling that accountability had been sacrificed to protect institutions. The Love Parade was never held again, its legacy permanently overshadowed by the events in Duisburg, and the disaster prompted widespread re-evaluation of crowd safety regulations in Germany and beyond, reinforcing hard-learned lessons about density limits, access redundancy, and the impossibility of compensating for structural flaws through on-the-day management alone. The Love Parade disaster stands as a stark reminder that modern mass tragedies are rarely caused by unforeseeable events or individual behavior, but by systems that prioritize image, profit, and political success over safety, ignoring warnings until human bodies become the final measure of failure. And in Duisburg, beneath railway tracks in a concrete tunnel never meant to hold 1 million lives, the cost of those choices was paid in silence, breath by breath, until celebration became catastrophe.